April 12th, 2021. Hi, my name's Tom Yakopin, and this is the Tom Yakopin Podcast, also known as Yakopinions. You can find us on the web at tomyakopin.com, Facebook, Spotify, on and on. And hopefully, if you like the content of the podcast, I encourage you to subscribe, like it, and share it with your friends and family. Hopefully, we provoke you to do some thinking, which is really the goal of my podcast. Today, I want to talk with you about an interesting trend that is occurring in the United States. For example, I woke up today, and as is my normal ritual, had a nice cup of coffee, got on my iPhone and began to check out my email, look at my to-do list, Facebook, this, that, and the other thing. And a local talk show host who I actually think is doing a great job on KDKA, Marty Griffin, posted today. He said, quote unquote, the sheriff's department had nearly 1,000 people request gun permits in a single day over the weekend. That's a record number. A huge number of women now want guns. And he asked this question, what are so many afraid of, and why so many women? And there were, as an example, there were 17 shares to this particular question and 313 comments, many of which sounded like this. Common sense and the realization that law enforcement is not always around. Many people will not get involved or come to aid, and that people have the capability and responsibility to protect themselves. Or here's another response. That's awesome. They're exercising their free rights as free Americans. Another local gentleman, their government. The same fear free men have always had historically, their government. Rise in violence in America, and often police won't be there on time. You got to protect yourself, and on and on. But it began a very positive discussion, I believe, and one that's near and dear to me as a young man growing up in Western Pennsylvania, where guns and shooting, gun clubs, hunting, have always been a big part of our community. For example, here today, and this is just for visual, but I want to use this, and I'm going to prove a point a little later in the day. This is a gun, right? And this is a semi-automatic handgun that has the capability of discharging 9mm rounds as fast as one can pull the trigger. That makes it a semi-automatic, in some people's mind, an assault weapon, right? Here's another weapon. This is a gun that my dad procured through the Citizens program following his return from service in the United States Army. He was deployed to the island of Saipan in World War II, served there as a technical sergeant. But came home and he purchased an M1 Garand, and this is the M1 carbine, which is, one of those fearful designs, right, with the high-capacity magazine, semi-automatic. And again, this can deploy rounds, 30 caliber rounds, as fast as you can pull the trigger, and would certainly by many be considered an assault weapon. But there's something about these that I want you to watch throughout our podcast as they sit there. We'll get back to them in a minute. And I really want to talk with you about what a gun is as an inanimate object. By the way, this particular gun has been in the Yakopin family. I'm going to be 60 this month, if you can believe it. I know. How could a guy that looks this good be turning 60 in April? Well, it's true, okay? But this weapon's been in my family for as long as I can remember, 60 plus years. It sat in the corner of the house when I was a young man as, self-defense or whatever Dad purposed for it. But other than the few rounds I've shot through it just to have some fun, it's never done anything to anybody. Because what you'll note is these guns are inanimate objects. They are only going to do what the owner or gun owner, or in the case of criminal activity with the gun, the perpetrator, they're only going to do what they're directed to do by perhaps a criminal or an evil person. We'll get to that in a minute. But what is the premise for gun ownership in the United States? And I want to read to you some thoughts from author Patrick Jakeway from The American Thinker that actually, I think these thoughts are worthwhile. And I quote, "In speaking with many fellow gun owners, I've come to realize that most people don't know that the Second Amendment does not give us the right to bear arms." And you know, when you first hear that, especially if you're like me, a lover of the Second Amendment, my producer and I often talk about two critical amendments, and that is the First Amendment, right, the right to free speech, and the second, which gives us the protection from tyranny and other things, and certainly the protection to protect the First Amendment, the right to free speech and say what I want, what's on my mind. But he goes on to say, Patrick Jakeway, that the Second Amendment doesn't give us the right to bear arms. And I thought to myself, where is this gentleman going with this? He goes on to say that the Second Amendment states that the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay? So I want you to notice something. It doesn't confer that right. The Second Amendment is an admonition to government that it may not take away your individual right to bear arms, which is inherent. And this goes back to something I've been saying throughout the year, even as it relates to governors in certain states issuing executive orders which seem to set aside your natural right or inherent rights in various states' constitutions, right? In other words, the Constitution themselves, the words on these printed documents, I do not believe confer the rights to us at all. I think they enumerate the rights. In other words, they put in writing the rights that thinking men and women have discovered are ours as free moral beings created in the image and likeness of God. Or if you do not believe in God, natural rights, okay, meaning they are inherent the day you're born. They're yours. Your right to defend yourself, your right to defend your loved ones, your right to defend your property, which is also enumerated in the Constitution as an inherent or natural right. Your ability to pursue, to acquire property, to protect and defend it, right? Your wealth. He goes on to say that it is an admonition to government that it may not take away your rights. But again, he believes, as I do, that arguing the Second Amendment merely from a legal or constitutional framework is folly because, as we have seen with government overreach, it is easy to reinvent or redirect or to, change the narrative, if you will, as it relates the definition of terms. And we're going to talk about a major landmark ruling some while ago, looking at the Second Amendment rather than as collective or militia rights alone, where the Supreme Court did decide strongly for individual rights. But I say, I'm with Patrick Jakeway, that I don't think it is in the hands of courts at all, nor in men and women in robes to determine if I have the right to own a weapon to protect myself, my loved ones, or my property. But Patrick goes on to say, what then is the origin of the right to bear arms? And he goes on to say, while our forefathers had inherited rights and liberties as Englishmen, those rights were curtailed and suppressed, which eventually led to what? The Revolution. Without the many citizen soldier militiamen, such as the Minutemen, the new United States would not have won the War of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, thus central to our liberties and our law, the Constitution was implemented to secure those rights, not to confer them. And I hope you understand the difference. Okay? It is enumerating, it is securing, it is itemizing them in great detail. But we do not get our rights. They are not conferred by the Constitution and thus by the government in control of that Constitution, they are inherent or natural rights. Considering the critical involvement of the citizen soldier in the Revolutionary War, it is clearly evident why the Founding Fathers wrote in the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Englishmen in the American colonies had inherited a right to bear arms from the English, subject to the whims of Parliament, but Jefferson and the Founding Fathers transformed the right to use the force to protect yourself and your family into a corollary of the unalienable rights to life and liberty set forth in the Declaration of Independence. These unalienable rights were secured as foundational laws in a new American nation born of liberty through the midwife of the Revolution. So that's a premise upon which I wanted to chat with you today. And then again, some other things that I feel might be noteworthy, and this is from the Washington Post. And again, I'm going to go on and quote from Noah Schusterman here, who is an assistant professor of history at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the author of The French Revolution, Faith, Desire, and Politics. And he says, love it or hate it, the Second Amendment provides the constitutional framework for American gun laws. And with all things constitutional, Americans are adapting 18th century laws to fit 21st century lives. And again, you wonder where is he going with this, and there are various arguments on that. But in reality, the concerns of the Founding Fathers had little to do with either side's position in the modern gun control debate. None of the issues animating that debate, from stand your ground laws to assault weapon bans, entered into the founders' thinking, and I would have to concur. I think he's right. Yet because both sides in the debate about the Second Amendment invoke what the Founding Fathers would have thought, it's important to look at what they actually intended. And I learned years ago, I went to a small Bible school, believe it or not. And there were certain classes that were mandated, a couple of years of Greek, a class on the study of interpretation, isagogics, hermeneutics, and homiletics class, right? Homiletics is how to speak. Hermeneutics, the science of interpretation, and isagogics, using a historical frame of reference to look at a historical text and interpret it inside of the framework of those who wrote it and their understanding of things then. And that's important. Again, hermeneutics, so you've learned something new today. Hermeneutics, homiletics, the art of the science of speaking, but isagogics, how to interpret something inside of contextual framework or historical framework. So the Founding Fathers, number one, were devoted to the militia. Interesting. And I would have to say that is correct. Read the debates about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the militia's importance leaps off the page. Alexander Hamilton, writing in the Federalist Papers, called a well-regulated militia the most natural defense of a free country. His anti-federalist critics agreed with the need for a citizens' militia, writing that a well-regulated militia composed of the yeomanry of the country have ever been considered as the bulwark of a free people. Their disagreement was over how to best ensure that the militia was maintained, as well as how to divide up the roles of the national government versus state governments. Both sides were devoted to the idea that all citizens should be part-time soldiers. Note this, because both sides believed a standing army was an existential threat to the ideas of the revolution, which, by the way, if you talk with many people who I think properly understand the Second Amendment. You talk with people and say, well, you don't need a gun that looks like that to hunt deer. Well, I don't believe the Second Amendment was enumerated or put in writing in the public domain for deer hunting. I think that the founders, as many today, believe. I think that the idea of a standing professional army presents a certain threat that is quite challenging in the minds of some, especially when you consider historically a regime like Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. If the wrong people get in power in a government that controls a powerful standing army, then wherever they direct the full force of that standing army, or to whomever they direct that full force, those people are in great threat of harm. And historically, governments that get out of control, whether it's Benito Mussolini, whether it was Mao Zedong, whether it's Adolf Hitler, Stalin, the Bolshevik Revolution, I mean, the standing army under control of that particular regime became a problem, right? Because they were what? Just doing their job, right? So keep in mind, the founding fathers clearly had a major concern about a standing army, and the militia, meaning what? Meaning men, primarily men, at least at that time, who owned weaponry, who were well equipped with the weaponry. They knew how to shoot it. They knew how to load it. They knew how to make or keep ammunition, etc. Those guys on call presented a certain level of freedom for this new state and the new government. Number two, the author here at the Washington Post brings up that the amendment's primary justification was to prevent the United States from needing a standing army. And once again, preventing the United States from starting a professional army, which George Washington, if you read George Washington's farewell address, and I highly recommend you do, although I think every enemy of freedom and liberty has also, and they've pretty much done everything he said not to do. Basically, it would appear today that we are doing. And everything that he said to do, it appears that we're really not doing. But at any rate, he was very concerned about the cost of a standing army. And then to add to that, today, the United States of America, we've got military deployed all over the world as the guardian of the globe, for crying out loud, which is a very costly expense to the taxpayer. Okay, I must tell you. But at any rate, so the second thing in this particular author's mind, and I think he did a good job with this article, Noah Schusterman, he believed that the amendment's primary justification was to prevent the states from needing a standing army. He goes on to say that the authors of the Bill of Rights were not concerned with an individual or personal right necessarily, although, note this, before the landmark 2008 Supreme Court case, which we'll talk about, the District of Columbia versus Heller, he believed that was more focused on calling up men trained and capable, and with arms, by the way, as a local militia, state's militia, in the event of it was necessary. But there were some who argued that the Second Amendment, and some still hold this today, that the Second Amendment is primarily dealing with the collective, or this business of a militia, who some today would say is, for example, the National Guard. And since we have a National Guard and a professional standing army, nobody in town needs an individual method of protecting themselves. Or you will hear some who are anti-Second Amendment, or some who are pro-gun restriction, gun laws, say that the citizenry should not have assault-style weapons, which is absolutely ridiculous, because, as if to say that all we should have is a musket or something, a one-bullet black powder weapon that looked like what the founders were using in 1776. But he goes on to say this was an argument and a concern. But note this, in the Supreme Court case, the District of Columbia versus Heller, courts had ruled that the right of individual citizens to bear arms existed only within the context of participation in the militia. In Heller, the Supreme Court overturned that precedent, delivering gun rights advocates their biggest legal victory. Now, This author says this was not a return to original understanding. I don't know. I tend to believe it was. But nevertheless, I go back to our rights as I understand them didn't come from the Constitution or the amendment to begin with. Our rights are natural rights to protect ourselves with whatever legal defense or whatever defense we find necessary. And obviously, if you're going to have a weapon for personal protection, it makes sense that you have the most contemporary weapon available on the market at any given time. Okay. By the way, a friend of mine brought up an interesting point the other day. He said, Tom, it's kind of interesting that the people arguing against walls at the border of our nation and arguing gun rights right now have a wall around their main building in Washington protected by people with guns. You know, it's kind of an interesting point. But the truth is that today the Second Amendment is under attack, and it's not just political attack. It's an attack of ideas. It's an attack of understanding what the point of protecting oneself is all about. It's an attack on understanding. I think some people are just freaked out by guns in general because of ignorance. And I don't mean that they're bad or stupid people. They just don't know. They don't know for example, this business of assault rifles, the hairy, scary assault rifles, the ones that look military, right? The truth is, if you shoot somebody with a single shot shotgun, something that was used 70 years ago to shoot a pheasant, and that guy is shot dead in the head with a 12 gauge shotgun, versus being shot with a 30 caliber assault rifle. Is he any less dead? Or was he any less assaulted? The point is that a bullet, a round, a projectile, a high-speed projectile is a deadly projectile, right? Whether it is delivered in the single-shot version or through the barrel of a semi-automatic version. By the way, in the United States of America, for those of you who don't know, to get a fully automatic weapon, right? That's the one where you hold the trigger and it's just, a machine gun. You have to have a special license to get that. They're not available easily. They are not readily available at gun shows or Aces Sporting Goods or Walmart. Semi-automatic rifles are, and that's the ones that as fast as you pull the trigger like this or like this. That's what many and most guns in the field are today. Why? Because it's sophisticated rather than bolt action or pump action. But the point is, a lot of it's just misunderstanding. And the media, for whatever reason, and certain politicians, for whatever reason, seem intent on whipping up a lot of fear among the ranks of people, using terms like assault weapon, which is foolish because, once again, the amendment doesn't make a particular reference to barrel length, to the type of apparatus the weapon is. It just talks about no infringement on the right to keep and bear arms, period. Any kind of arms. Okay, semi-automatic, single shot, shotgun, 30 caliber, 30-06, 243, 270, 257 Roberts. It doesn't matter. Okay. Number 4, the author says the founding fathers were very concerned about who should or should not be armed. These restrictions on military membership are critically important to understand, but despite the words of the Second Amendment, 18th century laws did not infringe on Americans' rights to bear arms. Laws rarely allowed free blacks to have weapons. That was interesting. It was even rarer for African Americans living in slavery to be allowed to have them. In slave states, militias inspected slave quarters and confiscated weapons they found. There were also laws against selling firearms to Native Americans, although these laws were a little bit more ambiguous. These restrictions were no mere footnote to gun politics of the 18th century. White Americans were armed so they could maintain control over non-whites. Non-whites were disarmed so they would not pose a threat to the white control of American society. And again, I'm pointing this out to just share with you that when we begin to restrict, when we begin to make laws on commerce, on ammunition, on the import or export of weapons, in a very real way, we get into infringement, and a certain class of society becomes disenfranchised. And I thought we were moving away from that, okay? So at any rate today, as we bring this to a close, the Second Amendment of the United States, saying what? Saying that you, as a sovereign citizen of this nation, have the right to keep and bear arms. It enumerates that. It says that the government shall not infringe your right. I think it's a very important concept to embrace, and I think it's something to think through and share, and perhaps even begin discussing with your children, your friends, your family, or where you find fear or misunderstanding. Maybe bring some correction and maybe bring some light to the subject. Why? Because typically you find that this is where tyrannies grow, right? I've been told that in China, obviously under Mao, one of the first things they did was disarm the people. They wanted to make sure folks didn't have the ability to protect themselves. The same in Nazi Germany, on and on and on. I think it's important today also to teach gun safety. I don't know how many of you remember when you got your hunter's license, there was a hunter safety course that was mandatory. I can remember my father, Frank Jacopin, how much I loved when he would open the gun cabinet, teaching me some of the fundamentals about guns. What was one of the first things he said? You never point a gun at anything or anybody you don't want to shoot dead. Okay. Why, Dad? He said, more people are killed accidentally with an empty gun than you could imagine, right? So one of the first things he began to teach me is the impact of one of these projectiles. One of the other things that my dad taught me is this: once you shoot that projectile, once it goes out your barrel, you're not getting it back. So you need to know where that projectile's going. And there's a certain respect for guns that I think should be taught and embraced rather than fear. You know, another interesting thing about guns and shooting, it used to be a sport that was very common in many high schools. Okay. It was not uncommon to see guns hanging in the back window of a pickup truck in a parking lot at a school with no fear. Okay. Which leads me to my closing thought. If you've noticed, both of these guns have sat on the table throughout my entire rant today, which has probably been at or around 40 minutes or so already. And these guns haven't done anything. They haven't done anything to you. They haven't done anything to me, haven't done anything to my producer, nor will they. Why? Because they're inanimate objects. They're only going to do what their owner says to do. Okay? And I want to go back to this business of crime today and mass shootings and talk about my opinion as it relates to the value of life. I think all life matters. Okay. To be very frank with you, I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in killing and murder. I think it's a travesty, the wars that we have conducted as a nation around the globe and other nations. I actually think that one of the most dangerous groups of people on planet Earth are politicians and politics in general, in that they amass the ability and the authority to pay and train standing armies. And if you think about it, these organized standing armies have been commanded to do some of the most atrocious things ever in human history. But these guns are innocent. They're just inanimate objects. They don't do anything unless or until a human being directs them to do so. And I want to say something to you today. If somebody is killed in a mass shooting with a weapon such as this one here or this one here, is the gun to be blamed? Or is the criminal to be blamed? For example, if a drunk kills somebody with a vehicle Is the vehicle manufacturer now guilty for the fact that this drunk used the tool inappropriately? Or do we hold the drunk culpable? Do we hold the drunk liable for the civil or criminal penalty? Or do we sue Toyota or Ford? And one of the challenges that I see today is there's talk about going after the manufacturer, right? Which again, I think is another form of infringement. Or, these, what are they called? Red laws, or where you can let authorities know that somebody might be a threat with a gun, and the authority now has the ability to crash into that home and take weapons from people. I just think there's a trend today in the wrong direction, as it relates one's liberty to keep and bear arms. And I think a lot of it has to do with ignorance and fear on one hand. And that's where you and I can shore things up through education and responsible gun ownership, mentorship programs, hunting programs, teaching the youth the practical utilization of guns. Yes, if somebody is in a dire strait, for example, you might say, well, I don't like guns and I don't like gun owners. But let's just say, for example, that you were in a grocery store where a criminal who was intent on killing a lot of people pulled a weapon and began randomly shooting. What if somebody like me were concealed carrying at that time and took out the perpetrator and saved you and your family? All of a sudden, you might like gun owners, you see. The point is that these guns, yes, there's evil that can be accomplished with guns. But it is not the gun itself, it's the person. And if we continue down the path of making it harder and harder for law-abiding citizens to keep and own and afford not only guns but ammunition, eventually the only people that are going to be well-armed are the bad guys. My name's Tom Yakupin. This is the Tom Yakupin Podcast, and this is my opinion for today. Give me some feedback on your thoughts on the Second Amendment, gun ownership. You can email me. You can visit us online at tomyakupin.com. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed our comments today, subscribe, like the show, and pass it on. Thanks for joining me, and bye for now. Special thanks to West Penn Life and Health, one of our sponsors. You can find them online at westpennlife.com, specializing in affordable life, health, Medicare, and retirement solutions.